Welcome to our deep dive today. We're going to be tackling some really interesting economic concepts, specifically scarcity and choice.
Sounds fascinating.
It is, and we've got a great document here that you've given us
Yeah.
to sort of guide our conversation. Strand 1.2, the economic concepts of scarcity and choice.
Excellent choice.
Yeah, and I think, one of the things that I always find interesting about economics is that it's something that we all experience every single day.
Absolutely.
Whether we realize it or not. So I'm really curious to kind of get into this concept of scarcity and how it relates to our daily lives.
Well, I think, to begin with, it's important to kind of define economics.
Okay.
And the document actually provides a really succinct definition. It says, economics is the study of the allocation of scarce resources between competing ends.
So already we're seeing this word scarcity popping up.
Right. And it's fundamental to economics.
And what does that really mean, though? I mean, I think a lot of people, when they hear scarcity, they think about, running out of something or not having enough. But is it really that simple?
It's a bit more nuanced than that, I would say.
Okay.
Because scarcity isn't about just physical shortages. It's about the fundamental relationship between unlimited wants
Mm-hmm.
and limited resources. So even in a world of abundance, we still face scarcity because we always want more than we can have.
So it's that constant tension
Yeah,
between our desires and the resources available to actually fulfill them.
precisely. And this applies to everything time, money, energy, natural resources.
I mean, even like attention.
Right, absolutely. That's a great example.
Like you think about in today's world, we are bombarded with so much information
Yes,
and we only have so much attention to give.
right.
So how do we choose what to focus on, what to prioritize?
You're already getting to the heart of economics. Because at its core, economics is the study of how we make choices.
And that's a perfect segue because this document also briefly mentions this idea of needs versus wants.
Yes.
And I think we probably touched on this in previous deep dives.
We may have.
But just as a quick recap, can you remind us how those concepts relate to scarcity?
Sure. So needs are those things that are essential for survival.
Right.
Food, shelter, water. Whereas wants are things that enhance our lives, make them more enjoyable, but aren't strictly necessary.
Okay.
And scarcity forces us to make choices about which needs and wants to satisfy.
Yeah.
Because we can't have everything.
It's so true. I mean, I'm constantly grappling with this. Like right now, I'm trying to decide, do I really need that new phone that just came out?
Mm-hmm.
Or should I be saving for that trip I've been wanting to take? It's a classic economic dilemma.
Absolutely. Every choice we make comes with a cost.
Right. And I think that's where economics can be really helpful because it gives us tools to understand those costs.
It provides a framework for analyzing those trade-offs.
Exactly.
So we can make more informed decisions.
Okay, so we've talked about scarcity and choice and this tension between needs and wants.
Yes.
But the document also mentions these factors of production, which are essentially the building blocks of everything around us. So let's dive into that a little bit. We've got land, labor, capital, and enterprise. Let's start with land. That one seems pretty straightforward.
Yes. Land refers to the natural resources
Okay.
available for production. It includes things like minerals, forests, water.
The raw materials.
Exactly.
Okay,
But those raw materials need to be transformed into something useful, and that's where labor comes in.
right. So labor is the human effort.
Yes. It's the physical and mental effort involved in production.
Okay.
And it's important to note that labor isn't just about the number of workers.
Right.
It's also about the quality of labor. Skills, education, knowledge, all these things contribute to a more productive workforce.
So it's not just about bodies, it's about brains too.
Exactly. And then we have capital, which often gets misunderstood.
Yes, because a lot of people think capital just means money.
Right. But in economics, capital refers to the tools and resources
Okay.
that enhance production.
Okay, so it's like the machinery, equipment, infrastructure.
Precisely. And capital is categorized into three main types: fixed capital, working capital, and social capital.
Let's break those down a little bit. So fixed capital, I imagine, is the physical stuff.
Yes. Fixed capital includes things like machinery, factories, tools,
Okay,
the things that are relatively permanent.
the infrastructure of production.
Precisely.
Okay, and then working capital is more about the stuff that's constantly flowing.
Exactly. Working capital includes raw materials, unfinished goods.
Inventory,
Yes.
the things that are constantly being used up and replenished.
Precisely.
Okay, and then social capital. This one's a little bit more abstract.
Social capital is often overlooked,
Mhm.
but it's incredibly important. It refers to the network's relationships and institutions
Okay.
that facilitate economic activity.
So things like trust, social norms, legal systems.
Yeah. Exactly. Those things create an environment where businesses can thrive and transactions can take place smoothly.
It's like the glue that holds everything together.
Precisely.
Interesting. And then the document mentions these concepts of capital widening and capital deepening.
Yes.
Can you explain the difference between those two?
Sure. Capital widening occurs when a company increases its capital stock at the same rate as it increases its workforce. So it's about maintaining that ratio.
So like if you hire more employees, you also buy more equipment so that everyone still has the same level of access to the tools they need.
Precisely. Capital deepening, on the other hand, is when a company increases its capital stock at a faster rate than its workforce.
So it's about giving each worker more and better tools.
Exactly.
Okay, so capital deepening is about increasing productivity.
Right. It's about making each worker more efficient.
Got it. Now, the document also talks about this idea of investment or capital formation.
Yes.
And essentially what we're talking about here is adding to the stock of capital.
Precisely. Investment is the process of creating new capital,
Okay.
and it's crucial for economic growth.
Because it allows us to produce more goods and services.
Exactly.
Now, the document differentiates between gross investment and net investment.
Yes.
So what's the distinction there?
Gross investment is the total amount of investment,
Okay.
but we have to consider depreciation,
Right.
which is the wear and tear on existing capital.
So things break down, become obsolete.
Exactly.
So net investment is gross investment minus depreciation.
Precisely. And net investment is the true measure of how much our capital stock is growing.
It's like even knowledge, right, requires investment to stay relevant.
Absolutely.
You have to keep learning, updating your skills, or your knowledge depreciates.
Very true.
Interesting. And this brings us to another really key concept, opportunity cost.
Ah, yes, one of the most important concepts in economics.
And one that I think a lot of people struggle with
It can be tricky.
because it's not always obvious.
Right. Opportunity cost is what we give up when we make a choice. It's the value of the next best alternative.
So like, for example, if I'm deciding between studying for an important exam and going to a concert,
Yes.
if I choose to study the opportunity cost, is the enjoyment I would have gotten from the concert.
Precisely. And if you choose the concert, the opportunity cost is the potential benefit you would have gained from studying.
And this is where this idea of the production possibility curve comes in, right?
Exactly.
I know the document mentions some videos that go into detail on that,
Yes.
but maybe you can just give us a quick rundown of what that curve represents.
Sure. The production possibility curve shows the different combinations of two goods or services
Okay.
that an economy can produce,
Okay.
given its resources and technology.
So it's like a visual representation of those trade-offs.
Exactly. And it illustrates the concept of opportunity cost at a macro level.
So, for example, if a country decides to produce more cars, it might have to produce fewer computers.
Precisely. Because resources are scarce.
Right. And I guess that leads to the question of who decides what gets produced.
Yes, that brings us to the different types of economic systems.
Right. The document mentions three main types: centrally planned economies,
Yes.
free market economies, and mixed economies.
Right. In essentially planned economy, the government makes most of the decisions.
So they decide what gets produced, how it gets produced, and who gets it.
Exactly. Like in China, for example.
Okay, and in a free market economy, it's more about the forces of supply and demand.
Precisely. Individuals and businesses interact in the marketplace.
Okay.
And prices are determined by the interplay of supply and demand.
So like the USA is considered a free market economy.
More or less, yes.
Okay, and then we have mixed economies, which, as the name suggests.
They combine elements of both.
So it's like a blend of government intervention and free market principles.
Precisely. And most countries in the world actually have mixed economies.
Like Ireland, for example.
Yes, Ireland is a good example of a mixed economy.
Okay, and I think what's interesting is that each system has its own strengths and weaknesses.
Absolutely.
So it's not like one is inherently better than the other.
It's about finding the right balance.
Right. It's about what works best for a particular country or society. Now, the document also mentioned this concept of indicative planning.
Yes.
And I'm not super familiar with that term. Can you explain what that is?
Sure. Indicative planning is a form of economic planning,
Okay.
but it's not as centralized or as rigid as an essentially planned economy.
Okay.
It involves the government setting targets
Yeah.
and goals,
Yeah.
but it also relies heavily on consultation and cooperation with businesses and trade unions.
So it's more about guidance and collaboration.
Precisely. And it's often used in mixed economies like Ireland.
Interesting. So it's like trying to find a middle ground
Yes,
between central planning and a completely free market.
exactly.
Now, when we talk about economics, it's not just about these abstract systems.
Right.
It's also about the people who participate in the economy.
Yeah.
And the document lists several key players:
Mm-hmm.
individuals, businesses, governments, and NGOs. And I think it's important to recognize that these different players often have different interests and goals.
Absolutely. And that can lead to some interesting dynamics.
Right, because what's good for one player might not be good for another.
Precisely. For example, individuals want to maximize their income, but businesses want to minimize their costs.
Right, so there's that tension there.
Yes.
And then you have governments that have to try to balance all these different competing interests.
Exactly. And that's one of the challenges of economic policymaking.
Right, because you have to make choices.
Yes,
And every choice has a consequence.
precisely. And that brings us back to that idea of cost-benefit analysis.
Okay, so we've talked about cost-benefit analysis at a personal level,
Yes.
like when I'm deciding whether to buy that new phone or go on a trip. But how does cost-benefit analysis apply to these larger economic decisions?
It's the same principle, but on a larger scale. So, for example, if a government is considering a new infrastructure project, they would weigh the potential costs of the project.
Like the financial cost, the environmental impact.
Exactly, against the potential benefit.
Like job creation, economic growth, improved transportation.
Precisely. So it's a way of making sure that the benefits outweigh the costs.
So it's about making informed decisions.
Exactly. And that's really what economics is all about.
It's about understanding how to allocate our scarce resources
Yes,
in a way that maximizes our well-being.
precisely.
You know, it's fascinating when you think about it. You know, if you were designing a society from scratch, what kind of economic system would you choose? I mean, would you go for a centrally planned economy?
Right.
Or a free market economy, or maybe something in between, like a mixed economy?
It's a great question, and there's no easy answer because, as we were just discussing, each system has its pros and cons. A centrally planned economy might be more efficient in certain areas, like, allocating resources for large-scale infrastructure projects, but it can also stifle innovation
Right.
and individual choice.
Whereas a free market economy, thrives on competition and innovation,
Absolutely.
but can lead to inequality and market instability.
Right, so it's always a trade-off.
Yeah. And then you have mixed economies, which try to find that balance.
Yeah.
That sweet spot between government intervention
Right.
and free market principles.
And most countries in the world today actually fall somewhere on that spectrum of mixed economies.
Right. And it's interesting how this document mentions indicative planning
Yes.
as a kind of a way to navigate those complexities.
Right. Indicative planning is a more collaborative approach
Okay.
to economic decision-making. It involves the government working with businesses, trade unions, and other stakeholders to develop economic strategies.
So it's less about top-down control and more about finding common ground.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that economic decisions affect different groups in different ways.
Yeah, and trying to find solutions that benefit a wider range of people.
Precisely.
Okay, so we've been talking about these different economic systems and how they allocate resources.
Yes.
But it's also important to remember that economics isn't just about abstract systems.
Right.
It's about people.
It's about human behavior.
Yeah, and the choices that we make.
Exactly. And the document highlights that there are several key players in this economic game.
We've got individuals, businesses, governments, and NGOs.
Right. And each of these players has its own motivations.
Yeah, and sometimes those motivations can be in conflict.
Absolutely. For example, individuals want to earn as much income as possible,
Right.
but businesses want to keep their costs low.
So there's that tension there.
Exactly. And governments often have to try to balance those competing interests.
Yeah, like trying to promote economic growth while also ensuring social welfare.
Right. It's a complex balancing act.
And then you have NGOs, which often advocate for specific causes or groups.
Yes, and they can play an important role in shaping economic policies.
Right. So it's a very dynamic and interconnected system
Really?
with all these different players interacting and influencing each other.
And that's where that concept of cost-benefit analysis becomes really important.
Right. Because we need to be able to weigh the costs and benefits of our decisions.
Exactly, whether those decisions are being made by individuals, businesses, or governments.
So I guess cost-benefit analysis isn't just something we do when we're deciding whether to buy a new phone or go on vacation.
No, it's a tool that can be applied to a wide range of economic decisions.
Like, for example, if a government is considering a new infrastructure project,
Right.
they would need to weigh the potential costs, like the financial investment and the environmental impact, against the potential benefits, like job creation and economic growth.
Exactly. It's about making sure that the benefits outweigh the costs.
So it's about making informed decisions.
Yes, and considering all the relevant factors.
And I guess that's really what economics is all about at its core.
It's about understanding how to make the best use of our limited resources.
Right, and making choices that lead to the best possible outcomes.
Exactly.
Wow, it feels like we've covered so much ground in this deep dive.
We have, and yet there's still so much more to explore.
I know, right? Economics is such a vast and fascinating subject, but I think we've done a good job of kind of unpacking some of those key concepts from this document. Strand 1.2, the economic concepts of scarcity and choice.
Absolutely, and I hope our listener has gained a better understanding of how these concepts play out in their everyday lives.
Me too.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's one key takeaway you'd like to leave our listener with?
Well, I think the most important thing to remember is that we all face scarcity, but that doesn't mean we have to feel powerless.
Right.
By understanding the principles of economics, we can make more informed choices.
Yeah.
And actually use scarcity to our advantage.
That's a great point. I mean, it's not about just accepting scarcity as a limitation. It's about using it as a catalyst for creativity and innovation.
Exactly.
So what's one small change our listener could make today to better allocate their resources, whether it's their time, their money, or their energy?
Well, I would encourage them to think about one area where they feel particularly constrained by scarcity.
Okay.
Maybe it's time management or financial planning or even just making decisions in general. And then apply some of the concepts we've discussed today.
Okay.
Think about the opportunity costs, weigh the potential benefits against the potential drawbacks, and make a conscious choice to shift your resources in a way that aligns with your goals and values.
I love that. It's about taking those abstract economic concepts and turning them into actionable steps.
Exactly. And it doesn't have to be overwhelming.
Right.
Start small, make one small change today, and build from there.
And remember, learning is an investment.
Absolutely.
The more you understand about economics, the better equipped you'll be to navigate the complexities of our world.
Precisely.
Well, this has been a truly enlightening deep dive.
It has.
I feel like we've really uncovered some valuable insights into the world of economics.
And how it shapes our lives.
Absolutely. And a big thank you to you for sharing your expertise with us.
It's been my pleasure.
And to our listener, thank you for joining us on this journey into the fascinating world of scarcity and choice. We hope you've learned something new, and we encourage you to keep exploring these concepts further. Until next time, keep diving deep.